Everything you were taught about prehistoric Europe being a wild, untouched paradise before humans arrived is wrong, and scientists have now used ancient DNA, fossilized pollen, and some of the most advanced computer simulations ever applied to human prehistory to prove it. The forests, the grasslands, the open woodlands, the mosaic of vegetation that ecologists spent decades calling pristine nature. None of it was pristine. It was engineered. It was shaped, burned, hunted into existence, and maintained by small groups of ancient humans tens of thousands of years before anyone planted a single seed or domesticated a single animal. And the most extraordinary part of this story is not just that we now know this. It is that the architects of Europe's original landscape were not even Homo sapiens. They were Neanderthals. This is the story of how the most famous wilderness in human history was actually the world's first managed landscape, and how science finally cracked open that secret. The idea that Europe before farming was some kind of untouched Eden has dominated ecological thinking for generations. Conservation biologists, rewilding advocates, and environmental historians have spent decades pointing to Europe's prehistoric past as the baseline, the standard of what nature looks like without human interference. If you want to understand what a forest is supposed to be, this logic goes, look at what Europe's forests were like before agriculture. Look at the deep past. Look at the wild. The problem with that logic, which has now been exposed by multiple converging lines of scientific evidence, is that there was never a moment in Europe's ecological history, at least not one accessible to us through the record, when humans were not already present and already changing things. Because the humans who were there, the Neanderthals, were not passive observers of their environment. They were active participants. They were engineers. The research that proved this came from an international team that included scientists from Aarhus University in Denmark, and was published in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS1 in late 2025, before receiving wider attention and additional supporting genetic evidence in early 2026. The study was remarkable for what it combined. It brought together ancient DNA analysis, fossilized pollen records extracted from lake sediments and peat deposits across Europe, and an agent-based computer model called Humland that was specifically designed to simulate how prehistoric human behavior interacted with vegetation dynamics across the continent. The team focused on two distinct time periods that allowed for a direct comparison. The first was the last interglacial, roughly 125,000 to 116,000 years ago, a warm period when Europe's landscape was lush and temperate and Neanderthals were the only humans on the continent. The second was the early Holocene, approximately 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. When the last ice age had ended, Neanderthals had been gone for roughly 30,000 years. And Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of our own species, Homo sapiens, were living across Europe. By comparing those two periods against each other and against what climate and megafauna alone would have produced, the researchers could isolate the specific ecological signature of human presence. What they found upended a century of assumptions. Before you can understand what the Neanderthals did to Europe's landscape, you need to understand what Europe's landscape actually looked like during the last interglacial. The continent was warm, in some regions warmer than today. It was dominated by forests, but they were not the dark, closed canopy forests that people sometimes imagine when they think of ancient Europe. They were structured by the presence of megafauna on a scale that modern Europe has completely lost. Straight tusked elephants weighing up to 13 tons moved through the landscape in significant numbers. Woolly mammoths roamed more northern regions. Cave lions, cave hyenas, aurochs, giant deer, and massive populations of bison grazed across the continent's grasslands and open woodlands. These animals were not decoration. They were ecological architects in their own right. Their grazing, trampling, and browsing maintained open vegetation. They ate trees before those trees could close into dense forest. They created grasslands by consuming ground cover, and they dug water sources through their movement that benefited hundreds of other species. The interplay between the megafauna and the vegetation was what kept Europe's landscape in its characteristic mosaic of open woods, grasslands, and forest patches. Into that ecosystem, Neanderthals arrived with fire and spears. The use of fire by Neanderthals is no longer scientifically controversial. Archaeological evidence confirms that Neanderthals were deliberately and consistently using fire by at least 400,000 years ago, long before modern humans evolved. They used it for warmth, for cooking, for manufacturing tools through a technique that heated flint to precise temperatures to improve its properties for napping, and, this is the part that the new research illuminates, for landscape management. When Neanderthals set fire to areas of dense shrub or woodland, they did not do so randomly. The research team found evidence, cross-referenced against pollen records from multiple sites across Europe, that Neanderthals showed consistent preferences for vegetation openness. They favored open environments similar to those their campsites were located in, and they modified vegetation toward those preferred conditions. Burning shrubland and woodland created open meadows that attracted the grazing megafauna they hunted. It cleared sight lines for hunting, It encouraged the growth of berry-producing plants and other food sources in the regenerating vegetation that followed burning events. It was, in short, a form of landscape management, primitive, opportunistic, and not consciously designed as such, but functionally equivalent to what later human cultures would do much more deliberately. The hunting behavior of Neanderthals contributed to landscape change through a mechanism that the researchers describe as the most overlooked factor in previous models of prehistoric ecology. When Neanderthals hunted the straight-tusked elephant, an animal weighing up to 13 tons, the largest land mammal in Europe at the time, they were not just acquiring meat, they were removing one of the most powerful grazers the landscape had ever known. Each elephant that a Neanderthal hunting group killed represented an enormous reduction in grazing pressure in the surrounding area. Fewer elephants meant less consumption of young trees and shrubs. Less consumption of young trees and shrubs meant those plants could grow into dense woodland that would otherwise have been suppressed. In areas where Neanderthal hunting was most intensive, the vegetation became immeasurably denser because the megafauna that had been keeping it open through constant grazing was being removed. And in areas where fire was used most frequently, the vegetation swung in the opposite direction, becoming more open and grass-dominated. The landscape that resulted from the combination of these two pressures was not natural in any simple sense. It was a human-influenced mosaic, shaped by the behavioral choices of a species that had been extinct for 40,000 years by the time modern environmental science began trying to understand it. The numbers from the research are striking precisely because they are so unexpected. The computer simulations, validated against pollen records from across Europe, found that Neanderthals affected approximately 6% of plant-type distribution across the continent and 14% of overall vegetation openness. Anastasia Nikulina of Aarhus University, one of the lead authors, was direct about the significance of those percentages. She described the Neanderthal effect as smaller than that of later hunter-gatherers, but still measurable. And for such low population densities, it represented a noticeable ecological role that earlier models had completely failed to capture. Neanderthal population across the entire continent during the last interglacial is estimated to have numbered only in the tens of thousands, possibly as few as 15,000 to 20,000 individuals, scattered across millions of square kilometers of landscape. The fact that such a tiny population was leaving a measurable ecological signature across 6% of continental vegetation patterns is extraordinary. If you're finding this as mind-bending as I am, subscribe right now, because this story gets even more surprising. The study did not stop with Neanderthals. By extending the simulations into the early Holocene period and modeling the behavior of Mesolithic Homo sapiens hunter-gatherers, the researchers were able to demonstrate something even more dramatic about the relationship between pre-agricultural humans and European ecology. By the early Holocene, the dynamics of European ecosystems had fundamentally changed. The megafauna that had structured the landscape during the last interglacial was gone or greatly diminished. Mammoths, straight-tusked elephants, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, all had vanished, casualties of the combination of climate change at the end of the last ice age and the expanding wave of Homo sapiens hunters spreading across the globe. The animals that had been doing the heavy lifting of ecological maintenance for hundreds of thousands of years had been removed from the system, and that removal left a landscape that was far more susceptible to modification by human behavior. Into that newly vulnerable ecosystem, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of our own species arrived with fire, hunting skills honed across generations, and population sizes that were growing as the warming climate made Europe increasingly productive and habitable. The impact was not subtle. The simulations found that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers may have influenced up to 47% of the distribution of plant types across Europe. Nearly half of all plant community distributions on the continent were shaped by the behavior of humans who had no agriculture, no metal tools, no writing, no domesticated animals, and no concept of managing the landscape in the way that farmers would later do. They were doing it anyway, through burning, through hunting, through the simple act of moving across the landscape and living in it in the way their ecology required. The scale of that influence makes a mockery of the baseline idea. The notion that there is a point in Europe's past before human influence that represents what nature is supposed to look like without us. There is no such point accessible to science. The pollen record goes back far enough to capture the last interglacial. And even there, even in the era of Neanderthals rather than modern humans, the human fingerprint is already present. It was always already there. This finding intersects with another extraordinary body of research that emerged in parallel, the DNA evidence that is reshaping our understanding of Neanderthals themselves as biological and cognitive beings. In late June 2026, a landmark study published in the journal Nature generated genetic data from 27 Neanderthals who lived in Belgium and France less than approximately 50,500 years ago, producing the richest genetic portrait of a late Neanderthal population ever assembled. The study, led by researchers including Bosums Mesa and colleagues, recovered genetic material from 26 Neanderthals from sites in Belgium and France, a feat of ancient DNA science that would have been considered impossible just a decade earlier. The findings revealed something that challenged prior assumptions about Neanderthal social organization. Most of the Neanderthals from Belgium and France were more closely related to one another than to contemporaneous Neanderthals elsewhere in Europe, pointing to a distinct regional population that nonetheless maintained broader connections across the continent. Genetic affinities were found between geographically distant individuals, one from the Mezmaiskaya cave in the Caucasus and one from Les Côtes in France, suggesting possible long-range connectivity between late Neanderthal communities that spanned thousands of kilometers. These were not isolated bands of primitive beings stumbling through a wilderness they did not understand. These were connected, socially organized populations with regional identities and continent-spanning networks. In April 2026, an equally significant genetic study published in Current Biology by researchers from the University of Bologna added another extraordinary dimension to the Neanderthal picture. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA from 8 Neanderthal teeth found in Stajnia Cave in Poland reconstructed what the researchers described as the oldest known Neanderthal group in Central Eastern Europe, dating to around 100,000 years ago. For the first time, scientists were able to observe a small community of at least 7 Neanderthals who lived at the same site in the same era, a genuine social group rather than isolated individuals scattered across different locations and time periods. Professor Andrea Pichin, who coordinated the research, described the result as extraordinary. The first time science had been able to rebuild a genetic picture of multiple Neanderthals from a single site, an era in that region. What emerged from that picture was a portrait of a real community, individuals with genetic relationships to each other, living together in a cave in what is now Poland 100,000 years ago, managing their local environment, hunting the megafauna of their era, and leaving an ecological mark that pollen records and computer simulations would eventually detect 100 millennia later. The combination of the ecological research and the genetic research produces a picture of Neanderthals that is radically different from the one that dominated popular and even scientific understanding for most of the 20th century. The old Neanderthal was brutish, barely articulate and capable of symbolic thought, living passively in a world it could not really comprehend. The Neanderthal revealed by the convergence of genetic science, ecological modeling, and pollen analysis is something entirely different. It is an intelligent, socially organized, ecologically capable hominid that actively managed its environment, maintained social networks across continental distances, formed identifiable communities with genetic histories, and left a measurable imprint on the landscape of an entire continent that persisted long after the species itself had vanished. The forests that grew denser where Neanderthals hunted, the grasslands that opened up where they burned, the mosaic of vegetation types that their presence generated, all of that outlasted the Neanderthals by tens of thousands of years. The landscape that the first Homo sapiens encountered when they arrived in Europe was not a pristine wilderness. It was an ecosystem that had been partially designed, through thousands of years of Neanderthal behavior, into something that suited human habitation. We inherited a garden. We just did not know it until now. The implications of all this for modern conservation biology and ecology are profound and still being worked out. The rewilding movement in Europe, which seeks to restore European landscapes to a pre-agricultural baseline by reintroducing lost species and removing human management, has typically pointed to prehistoric Europe as its model. Bring back the wolf. Bring back the bison. Let the land return to what it was. But what this research tells us is that the land was never not managed. The forest that conservationists are trying to restore is itself a product of human behavior, specifically of Neanderthal and Mesolithic hunter-gatherer behavior that shaped which plants grew where, how open the woodland canopy was, and which species occupied which ecological niches. Trying to restore a pre-human European landscape is, in the most literal sense possible, chasing something that does not exist. There is no pre-human European landscape in the time period that science can actually observe. There is only a landscape with humans in it, behaving in different ways at different scales of intensity. What that means for conservation targets, for rewilding goals, and for our understanding of what healthy European ecosystems actually look like, is a question that ecologists are only beginning to seriously engage with. But it starts with accepting something that this research makes inescapable. The wilderness was always a collaboration. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the science of who we really are and what we have always done to this planet is being rewritten faster than most people realize, and every discovery like this one changes the story in ways that matter far beyond the academic papers that contain them. There's one more dimension of this story that deserves careful examination, and it concerns the mechanism by which pollen became the key to unlocking a secret buried 125,000 years in the past. Pollen grains are almost indestructible. They are coated in a polymer called sporopollenin that resists decay more effectively than almost any other biological material on Earth. And when pollen falls into the still water of a lake or into the anaerobic conditions of a peat bog, it sinks and is preserved in the sediment in layers that correspond to different time periods. Palynologists, scientists who study ancient pollen, can extract cores from lake beds and peat deposits and read those layers like a book, identifying which plants were producing pollen in which quantities at which times. A rise in grass pollen relative to tree pollen indicates that the landscape was becoming more open. A decline in large-leaved broadleaf tree pollen and a rise in pioneer species that colonize disturbed ground indicates burning. A sudden shift in plant community composition that cannot be explained by climate change alone points to something else, something behavioral, something cultural, something human. The pollen records from sites across Europe, from Neumarkt Nord in Germany, from Starkar in Britain, from Lake Milkowski in Poland, from Meerstad in the Netherlands, and from dozens of other sites, all contained exactly those anomalous signals, changes in vegetation composition that climate models alone could not account for, open patches in landscapes that should have been forested based on temperature and rainfall data, shifts in plant communities that only made sense when human burning and hunting were added to the equation. These signals had been noticed before by individual researchers at individual sites, but they had typically been explained away or treated as local anomalies. What the new study did was bring all of those signals together, run them through a continental scale simulation model, and show that they were not anomalies at all. They were a consistent pattern. And the entity producing that consistent pattern, at least during the last interglacial period, was Neanderthal, a species that has been extinct since roughly 40,000 years ago, and that has left no written records, no monuments, and no traditions that any living human community can trace itself back to. The way we reconstruct the behavior of a species that left no writing and built no permanent structures is itself a kind of miracle of modern science, and it is worth pausing to appreciate how extraordinary it is that we can do this at all. Ancient DNA extraction from teeth and bones preserved in caves has improved to the point where researchers can recover genetic material from individuals who lived 100,000 years ago and reconstruct not just their individual genome, but their relationships to other individuals who lived at the same time and place. Agent-based computer models can simulate the movement and behavior of prehistoric populations across continental landscapes, updating their predictions with each new input until the simulated vegetation output matches what the pollen record actually shows. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones can reveal what they ate and where they traveled. Microscopic analysis of ancient hearths can determine whether fires were deliberately set and maintained or simply the product of natural lightning strikes. These tools, assembled and applied together by interdisciplinary research teams, have transformed Neanderthal science from a field of fragmentary inferences into something approaching a genuine portrait of a way of life. And the portrait that is emerging of an intelligent, ecologically active, socially connected species that shaped the European landscape over hundreds of thousands of years has something important to say, not just about the past, but about what it means to be human at all. The ecological footprint of a species is often treated as a modern problem, a product of industrial civilization, of fossil fuels and factories and global supply chains. But the research on Neanderthals and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers demonstrates that the ecological footprint of human-like intelligence is not a modern invention. It is a defining feature of cognitive species, operating at any level of technology. Even with only fire and stone-tipped spears, even with a population numbering in the tens of thousands scattered across an entire continent, Neanderthals left a mark on European vegetation that a continental-scale scientific study could detect more than 100,000 years later. The scale of the impact grew as the tools improved and the populations expanded. But the fundamental dynamic, intelligent beings modifying their environment to suit their needs and preferences, appears to have been present from the very beginning of the Neanderthal story in Europe. It may not be possible to separate intelligence from ecological impact. They may be, at some deep level, the same thing. Understanding that is not a reason for despair about what modern humans have done to the planet. It is a reason to think more carefully about what kind of ecological role we actually want to play, because the evidence now suggests that not playing one has never been an option.